the most feared man in Chicago, had never imagined his life would be saved by a 4-year-old girl. As he lay dying alone on the cold concrete floor of a locked steel vault, not a single bodyguard or doctor could reach him in time. The only person who slipped through the narrow gap of the door and stepped into that room was the small daughter of a housekeeper. It took her only a few seconds to recognize the familiar signs she herself had lived through many times before in her own short life. The little girl quietly opened her pink rabbit-shaped backpack, took out her very last EpiPen, and injected it into the dying stranger. She knew that if she gave away that dose of medicine, the next time her own deadly allergy came back, she might no longer have a chance to live. But she did not hesitate for even a moment. And that one innocent decision changed the fate of an entire mafia empire. Before we begin this deeply emotional story, let us know where in the world you are listening from, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to support us. Now, let the story begin. The Volkov estate rose at the northern edge of Lake Forest, a private compound of nearly 40 acres set behind stone walls that stood 3 meters high and had watched the northern shore of Lake Michigan for almost a century. Iron gates guarded the only entrance, black and heavy, worked by 2 men in dark coats whose earpieces never came out and whose eyes never rested. 2 German shepherds walked the perimeter every hour on a leash, held by a third man who never spoke. Thermal cameras blinked their small red lights along the top of the wall in a slow, patient rhythm that had never once faltered in 6 years. From the outside, the estate looked like something out of a slow winter dream. The long driveway curved between rows of bare oaks, their branches touched with the first thin frost of the season. A stone fountain stood dry in the center of the circular court. Black cars rested along its rim like animals waiting to be called. The main house rose in 3 stories of gray stone and tall arched windows, and every window on the ground floor was made of glass that could stop a rifle round at close range. But no one who stood outside those walls could feel what lived inside them. Damien Volkov walked the second-floor hallway alone, 32 years old, the youngest and most feared mafia boss in Chicago. And yet his steps on the pale marble made no more sound than a ghost passing through a museum after closing hours. He wore a charcoal suit cut close to his frame, a black shirt buttoned to the collar, no tie. His dark hair was combed back neatly, threaded with only the smallest hint of gray at the temples, though he was too young for it. His face carried the sharp lines of a man who had once known how to laugh, and had somehow, over 6 long years, forgotten the shape of it. His eyes were the color of Lake Michigan in the middle of winter, gray, blue, quiet, and cold at the surface. 4 times in 6 years, men had come for him. A restaurant in Miami, a hotel elevator in Detroit. Twice in his own city, once on a rainy night off the Kennedy Expressway, once in the parking garage below a jazz club on Rush Street. He had walked away from all 4, but each time, some smaller thing inside him had not walked away with the rest. A little more trust in a friend, a little more belief that men could be what they said they were. By now, there was not much of either left. The house held 40 rooms. 3 of them had felt like home once, long ago. For 3 years now, none of them had. No one was allowed to touch his food but himself. No one was allowed to enter his private study without knocking twice. He ate his meals alone at a table set for 1. He slept perhaps 4 hours a night, and never in the same room 2 nights in a row. He passed the closed door of the west corridor without turning his head. Behind that door lay the bedroom of Anya, his younger sister, gone at 15 from leukemia the doctors had caught too late. The door had not been opened in 12 years. A silver hairbrush still rested on her vanity, holding a single strand of dark hair. Damien walked on without slowing. Power can build a fortress, but never a home. And the man who builds the fortress usually has nowhere left to return to. Far to the south of Lake Forest, past the long silver spine of the city and the tangle of expressways that fed into it, another kind of morning was beginning its slow work. A small third-floor apartment stood above a laundromat on a quiet block of South Side, Chicago. The pale yellow light of early autumn came in through thin cotton curtains and fell across a chipped mug, a folded dish towel, and a photograph taped to the refrigerator door of a young man in a construction helmet with his arm around a woman in a green shirt. Both of them were laughing at something the camera would never know. Grace Miller opened her eyes at exactly 5:45, the way she had every morning for the last 2 years. 27 years old, dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, the kind of quiet, tired beauty that only revealed itself to people who bothered to look twice. She sat up slowly on the edge of the narrow bed, so as not to shake the small, warm body curled against her side. For 18 months after James had died, she had worked 2 jobs, one at a diner off Ashland and one cleaning offices downtown after midnight, and even then the money had not been enough. The EpiPens cost almost as much every month as the rent on this apartment. The new position at the Volkov estate up in Lake Forest paid 3 times what the diner had paid. She had not asked what the man of the house did for a living. She had asked only whether the pay was steady and whether the household staff carried health insurance. The answer to both had been yes, and that had been enough. Lily lay curled beneath a thin blue blanket, one small fist pressed against her cheek. 4 years old, she had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's serious mouth, but her expression while she slept belonged entirely to herself. Since the age of 15 months, she had lived with a severe anaphylactic allergy, one so sharp that the wrong protein in the wrong dish could close her throat in under 3 minutes. She had already been rushed to emergency rooms 4 times. Each visit had left something in the way she looked at the world. A small stillness, the sense that certain things did not have to be spoken aloud. Lily almost never cried. Lily almost never asked why. She had learned very early that the world was not a place where a child could stand in the middle of a room and demand a better outcome. In the small pink backpack, shaped like a soft round rabbit that sat on the chair beside the bed, there were always exactly the same things. 2 EpiPens, one of them due to expire the following week. A small packet of tissues, a worn stuffed rabbit no larger than Grace's hand. At 6:40, the phone on the nightstand buzzed. Grace read the message twice before it registered. The babysitter's own daughter had spiked a fever in the night. She could not come. She was so sorry. Grace sat on the edge of the bed with her hand pressed against her mouth for a long moment. Then she knelt down beside Lily and stroked her hair very softly. "Baby, you have to come with Mommy today. You have to promise Mommy you'll be very, very quiet." Lily nodded once. She did not ask why. Some mothers do not pray for miracles. They pray only for a chance to work honestly, and for one night of quiet sleep. They stepped off the northbound Metra at 8:15, into the kind of quiet that only certain neighborhoods on the North Shore knew how to hold. The station platform was almost empty. A single crow watched them from the roof of the ticket booth, as if trying to decide what business a mother and a small child could possibly have this far from where they belonged. Grace held Lily's mittened hand tightly, and they walked together along a road lined with tall old trees, whose bare branches touched above them in a slow gray arch. The estate rose at the end of that road, though for a long moment Lily did not understand that it was a house at all. The stone wall was so high that she had to tip her chin back to see the top of it. The iron gate stood taller than 3 men. A small red camera above it blinked at them once, patient and unhurried, and then blinked again. Grace pressed the call button beside the service entrance. A moment later, a side door opened. Edward Hastings was 58 years old, with hair the color of iron and eyes that had not forgotten what warmth was. He was the head of household staff at the Volkov estate, and in a house that had almost forgotten the sound of a friendly voice, he was the last of the old kind. He looked down at Lily and smiled, and for the first time all morning, something in Grace's shoulders loosened by half an inch. "You must be Miss Miller, and this small guest must be Lily." Lily nodded solemnly, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. Edward led them through the side corridor and into the main service wing. Lily walked with her chin tipped up, staring at the ceiling of the great hall as they passed it. 8 meters overhead, a chandelier of crystal and iron hung suspended in the pale winter light. The marble beneath her feet was so cold she could feel it through her thin woolen tights. He brought them to a small room at the back of the staff corridor. An old leather armchair sat beneath a warm yellow lamp. A skylight let in a soft square of morning above. "She can sit here, Miss Miller. No one comes down to this wing before 7 in the evening," Grace explained the allergy in low, careful words. Edward listened without interrupting, then took a small notebook from his vest pocket and wrote down the name of the medication and the dosage. He placed both of Lily's EpiPens on the small table beside the armchair, exactly parallel, exactly in reach. "Thank you, Mr. Hastings," Grace whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. Edward only shook his head, gently. "Go on. I'll walk her through introductions with the others when you're ready." While Grace was led away to meet the rest of the staff, Lily climbed carefully into the armchair. She was so small that her feet did not touch the floor. She opened a coloring book Edward had quietly set on the cushion, and she began, with the same slow patience she brought to everything, to color inside the lines. She did not ask. She did not fuss. She did not cry. In a room 3 floors above, in the corner of the security control station, a man in a dark charcoal suit watched a small camera feed. Victor Kane, 45 years old, silver at the temples, the black stone of a lion's head ring sitting on his index finger. His eyes rested on the mother and the child for 2 seconds. Then he leaned forward and typed several lines into the terminal beside him. Children who know how to be quiet are usually children who have already learned too many lessons meant for adults. At 11:40 in the morning, Damian Volkov walked the lower service corridor alone. A shipment of Russian vodka had arrived from the port the previous evening. 3 cases meant for a private cellar he inspected himself, and he had decided to look over them before lunch. He rarely came down to this wing. There was no reason he needed to. And yet on that particular morning, something in the pace of his own steps had told him to move. The corridor was dim, lit only by 2 brass sconces along the wall. Halfway down, a thin blade of warm yellow light spilled through the narrow gap of a door left slightly ajar. Damien slowed. He was not a man who paused without reason. He had learned in 20 years that a door left partly open in a house of 40 rooms was a small anomaly, and small anomalies were the ones that killed you. He stopped a step short of the light and looked through the gap. Inside the little staff room, in the deep leather armchair that had held countless tired staff members over the years, a small girl sat with her legs dangling in the air. She could not have been much older than 4. A pink backpack rested against her hip. A worn stuffed rabbit sat beside her on the cushion. Her feet did not reach the floor, and they were swinging in a slow, patient rhythm as she leaned over an open coloring book and worked quietly along a line only she could see. Something inside Damien's chest closed like a hand. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it in a hospital room on the northern edge of the city, in a chair too big for the person sitting in it, 12 years and 3 months ago. Anya, 15 years old, in a pale blue gown, coloring in the margins of a magazine so she would not have to look at the tubes running out of her arm. The same tilt of the head, the same small, careful bend of the shoulders, the same absolute, unremarkable, world-accepting quiet. Damien stood without moving for 5 seconds. He did not push the door open. He did not step into the room. He simply turned, very slowly, and walked back the way he had come. Upstairs, at the entrance to the main foyer, Edward Hastings was reviewing the afternoon schedule with a young footman. Damien stopped beside him and asked in a low voice who the child in the staff room was. Edward answered simply, "The daughter of the new housekeeper, Grace Miller." The babysitter had fallen ill that morning. She had had nowhere else to leave her. Damien gave one quiet instruction. Send lunch down to the staff room. Something warm, something a child would eat. Then he walked away without offering any explanation, and no one in that hallway had ever, in all the years they had worked for him, dared to ask for one. That afternoon, a small tray was carried down, a hot cheese sandwich cut into 2 neat triangles, a warm cup of milk in a china cup, a small plate of orange slices. Lily ate 1 careful triangle. Then she folded the napkin over the second and set it aside for her mother. When Grace returned an hour later and saw the covered plate, she pressed her hand against her mouth and cried without making a sound. Some hearts have been frozen for many years. Sometimes a single glance through a half-open door is enough to leave the first thin crack. While a warm cup of milk cooled slowly in a china cup 3 floors below, a very different kind of preparation was moving through the quiet upper rooms of the estate. Victor Kane sat in the corner of the security control station, one hand resting on the black stone of the lion's head ring on his index finger, the way a man turns over an old coin when he has been thinking about it for a long time. 10 years he had stood beside Damien Volkov. 10 years of morning briefings, of quiet nods across crowded rooms, of standing behind him at funerals and weddings and long tables of angry capos. He had walked out of a burning nightclub in Detroit at Damien's side. He had been the first man in the car after the ambush on the Kennedy Expressway. Damien trusted him more completely than he trusted his own blood. There were only 2 men in Chicago who knew the master combination to the private vault beneath the estate, and Victor Kane was one of them. 6 months earlier, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Victor had walked into a quiet bar off the Loop and had sat down across from a man named Ivan Petrov. Petrov was 55 years old, silver at the temples, with a long scar down his left cheek that he had earned in Vladivostok a lifetime ago. He was the head of the largest Russian family in the Midwest, and he had been waiting for a way into Chicago for 8 patient years. He set a glass down. He offered $20 million in bearer instruments and the second seat in a new empire. Once the Volkov empire had been quietly folded into his own, Victor had listened without changing his expression, and when Petrov had finished, he had said only one sentence. His father, Alexander Kane, had died on a wet January night in 1998, in a warehouse purge ordered personally by Damien's father. Victor had been 18 years old. He had been carrying a bag of his father's clothes home from the tailor when the phone call came. He had waited 27 years for this conversation. That night, after Damien had gone to bed and the last of the household lamps had gone out, Victor descended the private staircase into the technical wing of the basement. He worked for nearly 3 hours in the quiet white light of the vault ventilation panel. He rewired the emergency suppression system to release a dense inert gas at high concentration the moment the vault door sealed. He installed a remote lock override that could be triggered from any encrypted phone. He disabled the internal alarm channel and rerouted its signal to a dead relay. When he climbed the stairs again just before 4 in the morning, he was carrying a small screwdriver, a folded diagram, and a face as calm as still water. His plan was elegant in the way only patient plans are. A false intrusion signal would be sent to the master's private terminal. Damien would go down himself, He always did. He would not risk sharing the vault combination even with his most trusted men. The steel door would seal behind him. The oxygen would fall. The alarm would never sound. In the morning, the coroner and the household would agree, quietly, that the aging vault had failed. The following day, at 2:40 in the afternoon, Victor sent the false signal. Upstairs, Damien received the alert and rose from his chair without a word. Victor sat in the security room with his phone in his hand, thumb resting on the activation key, waiting. The most dangerous traitor is the one who has stood beside you long enough that you have forgotten how to doubt him. And by the time you remember, it is already too late. Damien took the private elevator down to the lower basement alone. The car descended with a small, clean hum, and the lights along the ceiling brightened one by one as he passed the levels. When the doors slid open, the corridor beyond was empty, lit only by cold white LED strips along the base of the walls. The vault door stood at the far end, 30 centimeters of hardened steel set into a frame of poured concrete 3 layers deep. He pressed his fingertip to the pad. He leaned forward for the retinal scan. The door pulled open with the soft, patient sigh of well-machined hinges, and he stepped inside. The room was exactly as he had left it a week before. The safe sat untouched, its dial polished, its seals intact. There was no scratch on the frame, no mark on the walls, no sign of anything at all. Behind him, the steel door closed. It did not simply swing shut, it slammed. The magnetic locks engaged with a sound like teeth grinding together, sharp and final, and the small red status light above the frame blinked once and went dark. Damien turned. He crossed the room in 2 steps and pressed his thumb to the internal control panel. Nothing responded. He tried the retinal scanner. The lens did not brighten. He looked up at the small camera in the corner of the ceiling. Its indicator was dead. For a moment, the silence in that vault was so complete that he could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then, very faintly, he smelled it. Something sweet, a little like almonds, a little like burnt sugar, so soft at first that a man not trained to notice it would have missed it entirely. The back of his throat began to itch. He swallowed once. The itch did not go. He swallowed again, harder, and there was already a strange thickness where his voice usually lived. Inert gas, high concentration, pushing the oxygen up and out of the room in a slow, silent tide. Damien drew his sidearm and put 3 rounds into the control panel. The metal jumped and sparked and gave him nothing. He turned and struck the vault door with the flat of his fist, then with the heel of his palm, then with his full weight. The sound of his own hand meeting the steel died against the concrete beyond as if it had never happened. He shouted once. Only a dry, ragged rasp came out of his throat. His chest began to squeeze in the wrong way. His heart was already running too fast. This was not only the thinning air. Something in the chemical composition of the gas had reached beneath his ribs and tightened its fingers there. A mild but climbing anaphylactic response he had never known his body could produce. 20 years of living in danger. He had prepared, quietly, in the back of his mind, for a dozen kinds of death. A knife between the ribs in a crowded hallway, a bullet through a windshield, a bomb under the booth of a restaurant he had frequented too long. He had never once prepared for a slow, silent death behind his own steel door, in a room only he had the codes to open. His knees gave. He slid down the wall and came to rest against the cold flank of the safe. In the pale light behind his closing eyelids, he saw his mother's garden of yellow roses at the eastern corner of the estate, the one she had planted the year before she died, the one no gardener had touched in 10 long summers. He saw Anya, 15 years old, tilting her head. He saw a small girl in a chair too big for her, feet swinging slowly above a marble floor. Before the dark rose over him entirely, he lifted one heavy hand and knocked 3 times against the steel. It was the last instinct of a man who did not want to die alone. Death does not always need a gun. Sometimes it needs only a door 30 centimeters thick and a small, golden silence. At 4:15 in the afternoon, in the small staff room 3 floors above, Lily reached for the china cup Grace had left on the low table and found it empty. She had drunk the last of the apple juice almost an hour before. Her tongue felt dry and heavy in her mouth. She sat still for a while, the way she always did when she was thirsty, and there was no one to ask. And then she slid down from the deep armchair and stood on the cold marble in her small woolen tights. Grace was 2 floors above her at that moment, wiping down the tall shelves of the Eastern Library. Her hands were full of a soft cloth and a small tin of beeswax polish, and she had begun humming, very quietly, an old lullaby she had used to sing when Lily was still small enough to be held. The library was thick-walled and set at the far end of the corridor. She did not hear the small footsteps beginning below. Lily stepped into the service corridor. Her tights made no sound at all against the pale marble. She turned left, remembering that her mother had said the kitchen was somewhere at the end of a long hallway. She thought perhaps she could ask the kind older man for a cup of water. He had smiled at her. He would not mind. At the corner where the corridor branched, she chose the wrong turn. A narrow set of servant stairs led downward instead of toward the kitchen. Lily, thinking it might be a shortcut, followed them all the way to the bottom. The corridor at the base of the stairs was not like anything she had seen upstairs. The ceiling here was lower. The air was cold in a different way. Cold like the inside of a refrigerator that had been closed too long. The lights were small and yellow and set into the walls at wide intervals. This was not the kitchen. This was somewhere no one had ever meant her to be. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A tiny sound. Metal against metal. 3 faint taps. So small that a grown-up walking past would not have noticed them at all. Lily stood very still. The way she had learned to stand still whenever her own chest had begun to tighten in the middle of a room. Then she followed the sound. The steel door stood at the far end of the corridor. It was tall and heavy and set into a frame of poured concrete, and in the middle of it, at exactly the height of a grown man's face, there was a small square window of thick glass. Lily rose up onto the tips of her toes. The man in the charcoal suit lay on his side just beyond the glass. His face was the color of old ashes. His lips were the color of a bruise. His chest was rising in a rhythm that was small and jagged and wrong. She recognized him. He was the man who had sent the warm cheese sandwich down to her yesterday. And she recognized the rhythm of his breathing too. She had felt that rhythm in her own throat 4 times in her short life. She knew exactly what it meant. She did not scream. She did not run for her mother. There was no time for either. She ran instead to the small red panel at the far corner of the corridor, the one the maintenance man had used that very morning, while she watched from her armchair through the open door. She pressed the wrong sequence 3 times. On the 4th, she remembered the order she had seen. The steel door hissed open exactly the width of a child's hand. Some doors can only be opened by hands too small to be suspected. Some rescues arrive only through the one everyone else has decided is weakest. Lily slipped through the narrow gap sideways, one small shoulder first, dragging the pink rabbit-shaped backpack behind her by its strap. The air inside the vault was thick and sweet, in a way that made her chest itch the moment she breathed it in. She coughed once, a small, careful cough, and covered her mouth with the sleeve of her cardigan the way her mother had taught her whenever the smell of something wrong was in the room. The man in the charcoal suit lay slumped against the side of the safe. His head had tipped sideways. His chest was barely moving now. The small bruise of his lips had grown a shade darker in the minute since she had looked through the glass. Lily crossed the concrete floor in 3 quiet steps and knelt down beside him. She set the small, worn stuffed rabbit on the floor next to his shoulder, so it could sit with him too. Then she unzipped the front pocket of the pink backpack and looked inside. 2 EpiPens rested there, side by side, exactly the way her mother had placed them that morning. One of them carried an expiration date from the previous week. Her mother had promised, in her tired late-night voice, that they would go to the pharmacy on Saturday for a new one. She had said it softly the way people say a thing they are not entirely sure they can afford. There was only one that would still work. Lily paused for the length of one small breath. Her mother had told her, kneeling in the kitchen 4 weeks earlier with her hands on Lily's shoulders, that this pen was only for when Lily herself could not breathe. But the man on the floor could not breathe either. She remembered the lesson exactly as it had been given on the couch pillow 4 weeks ago, with her mother watching. Pull off the blue cap. Press the orange end firmly against the outside of the thigh. Hold for 3 seconds. Count out loud. She pulled the blue cap. She pressed the orange end through the dark charcoal wool of his trousers. 1, 2, 3. She counted in a whisper. Then she drew the pen out and placed the used, empty tube back inside the pink backpack, aligning it neatly beside its expired sister, the way she would tidy her crayons at the end of the day. She picked up the stuffed rabbit and held it against her chest. She sat down cross-legged on the cold concrete beside the man and waited. 40 seconds passed. The bruised color at the edges of his lips began to fade. 60 seconds. His chest lifted once in a long, ragged, deeper breath, a sound that rasped and whistled but was undeniably alive. Only then did Lily rise to her feet. She walked back through the narrow gap of the door and out into the corridor. She turned toward the stairs, and she began to shout, in a voice that was far too small for a house of 40 rooms. "Someone is dying! Someone is dying!" Her voice broke on the second call. She shouted it a 3rd time anyway, and a 4th, walking backward down the corridor with the stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest and her small pink backpack bouncing lightly against her hip. Courage does not wait for age. It arrives in the smallest hands, and it does the thing the strongest men are too afraid to do. The small cry traveled up the servants' stairs like a needle finding a nerve. Marcus, one of the senior guards on rotation in the upper corridor, was the first to hear it. He had spent 9 years at Damien's side, and he had learned to trust his instincts before his ears. 2 seconds after the second call, he was already speaking into his sleeve, ordering the emergency team to the lower level and the door team to bring a torch. 6 armed men descended the stairs at a controlled run. When they reached the corridor at the base, they found a small girl leaning against the concrete wall, her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest, her eyes very wide and very dry. She could not speak. She only lifted one small hand and pointed. The steel door was already cracked open by the width of a child's hand. Marcus crossed the corridor in 4 strides, dropped to one knee at the threshold, and gave the order to cut. The torch team went to work along the magnetic seal. The air that seeped out through the widening gap carried the faint, sweet smell of almonds, and the first 2 men who stepped inside were on their knees within seconds, coughing hard. Dr. Reyes arrived within 2 minutes from the medical suite in the East Wing. He was 50 years old, silver at the temples, calm in the way only a man who had worked emergency rooms in his youth ever became. He took one look at Damien slumped against the safe and gave 3 short orders. The ventilation was cleared. Damien was carried up on a stretcher through the servants' stairs and into the private medical suite on the 3rd floor. A ventilator was fitted. An intravenous line was set. A second dose of epinephrine was pushed slowly into his arm. Victor Kane appeared in the doorway of the medical suite almost the moment the elevator opened. He had been just informed, he said, and his eyes were full of the correct expression of shock. No one in the room was looking at his hands. His fingers were trembling very faintly against the frame of the door. Grace was found in the Eastern Library and brought down. When she saw Lily in the corridor with the stuffed rabbit still pressed against her chest, she gathered the child into her arms and held her there without asking a single question. She did not yet know what had happened. She only knew that her daughter had been somewhere she should not have been, and that her daughter was still alive. Edward Hastings brought a soft gray blanket from the linen closet and wrapped it around both of them. His old hands were shaking as he tucked the corner behind Grace's shoulder. 3 hours later, Damien opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was pale. The monitor beside his bed beeped in a steady, even rhythm. His throat felt scraped, raw, and his mouth tasted faintly of metal. The first word he managed was 1 syllable, thin and cracked. Who? Dr. Reyes leaned closer. A small girl, sir, 4 years old, the daughter of your new housekeeper. Damien closed his eyes. His hand tightened, slowly, around the edge of the hospital sheet. Some lives are not saved by armies. They are saved by a single small injection, carried in a backpack shaped like a rabbit. Morning came very slowly over the estate. A thin gray light filtered in through the tall windows of the medical suite, and by 9, Damien was able to sit up on his own for the first time. He turned to Dr. Reyes and asked, in a voice still scraped and low, that the small girl be brought to him. Grace arrived a few minutes later with Lily's hand held tightly in her own. She stopped just inside the doorway and lowered her head, not knowing whether she had been summoned to be thanked or dismissed. Her fingers were trembling faintly against her daughter's palm. She had barely slept. She had spent the night on a chair beside the guest room bed, watching Lily's small chest rise and fall, not entirely trusting that either of them was still safely inside the world. Lily walked forward without hesitation. The stuffed rabbit was still pressed against her chest, one small ear beginning to fold from the way she had been holding it. She stopped beside the bed and looked directly up at the man lying there. Her gray-blue eyes met his without flinching, without curiosity, without fear. Damien looked at her for a long time. There was something in the tilt of her head that his memory had not been ready for, something in the shape of the small, serious mouth. Anya, at 4, had stood exactly that way beside their mother's hospital bed once, holding a paper flower she had made in kindergarten. The same quiet, the same directness, the same absolute lack of performance. He spoke very softly. His throat still burned when he did. Did you know that was your last one? Lily nodded. Then why did you give it to me? She looked down at the rabbit for one small moment. Then she looked back up. Because you were dying too. I know what that feels like. Damien closed his eyes. The thing inside his chest that had been frozen solid for 12 years cracked along a single fine line. Warmth, unfamiliar and painful, moved through the break. He held his breath for a moment so that neither of them would see it happen on his face. When he opened his eyes again, he looked past Lily to Grace, who was standing very still at the foot of the bed with her hands pressed flat against the front of her apron. You have raised your daughter very well, Miss Miller. Grace's shoulders folded forward. She could not speak. She only nodded, and the tears came without any sound. Damien gave his instructions from the bed itself, quietly, one after the other. Dr. Amelia Vargas, the senior allergy specialist at the Northwestern Medical Campus, was to be retained immediately for Lily's care, at no cost to the family, for as long as the child needed her. 30 of the newest generation EpiPens were to be ordered by the end of the day and distributed throughout the estate and every vehicle in the fleet. In her bedroom, in the kitchen, in each of the cars, in Grace's own handbag, and Grace and Lily were to be moved that same afternoon out of the small staff room and into the eastern guest wing, into the corner suite with the tall arched windows that looked directly out over Lake Michigan. Some debts cannot be paid in money. They can only be paid with the rest of one's life. Over the 3 days that followed, something very small and very strange began to move through the estate. The house did not become loud. The corridors did not fill with laughter. But the silence in the rooms shifted a shade, the way the light shifts when a window has been opened somewhere out of sight. Damien began to take his evening meals in the small dining room off the eastern gallery instead of alone at the long carved table in the study. On the second evening, he asked Edward to invite Grace and her daughter to join him. Grace hesitated for nearly a full minute before she accepted. She had never in her life sat down at a table set with 3 kinds of silver. Lily, who had never eaten in the presence of a man in a charcoal suit, sat on 2 velvet cushions to reach her plate. Between careful bites of buttered pasta, she told Damien the entire story of a small green caterpillar she had seen on a leaf outside the guest room window that afternoon. She described its journey along the branch in slow, serious detail. Damien, who had once questioned a rival captain for 6 hours without blinking, sat perfectly still and listened. Edward passed the doorway with a tray of coffee. He heard the small voice. He heard the master's quiet reply. He set the tray down in the kitchen and pressed the back of his wrist against his eyes for a long moment before he could carry it out again. Victor Kane also saw. His eyes were not the eyes of Edward. His first plan had failed cleanly, and Ivan Petrov's messages had begun to arrive twice a day now. Short, cold, impatient. He had to move again. This time he would move so that the blame landed on someone who could not push back. His gaze followed Grace as she carried a basket of folded linens past the security corridor. Within 48 hours, 3 things had been done. First, in the long hallway outside the linen room, Victor stepped aside to let Grace pass and clapped her lightly on the shoulder with the easy familiarity of a colleague. His hand slid down the fabric of her blouse and lifted the magnetic staff card from the breast pocket in a single motion she never felt. Second, through a shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name Iron Gate Holdings, $250,000 was wired into the small checking account Grace kept at a neighborhood credit union on the south side. She had not opened her banking application in nearly a week. She did not yet know the money was there. Third, he carried a small silver USB drive to Edward Hastings and told him, in the calm voice of the senior security officer, that it contained backup copies of certain private financial records the master wished to keep off the main servers. He asked Edward to place it in the small safe in the butler's office. Edward, who trusted Victor completely, nodded and locked it away without a second look. That night, Victor slipped into the technical control room with Grace's card, plugged the silver drive into the master terminal, and activated a code fragment that disabled the corridor cameras precisely across the 3 minutes surrounding the vault incident. Before he left, he pressed Grace's water glass, which he had taken from her tray that morning, gently against the corner of the control panel. Her fingerprints settled into the metal. The most dangerous man is not the one who stabs from behind. It is the one who places the weapon into an innocent hand and then walks away to let her be blamed for the wound. The Council of Capos was summoned to the great study at 3 the following afternoon. 6 men in dark suits took their seats around the long carved table, each of them the head of one arm of the Volkov organization. The doors were closed. The curtains were drawn against the low autumn light. The internal investigation team stood at the far end of the table with a folder that was nearly 2 fingers thick. The lead investigator, a lean man named Novak, read the findings aloud 1 point at a time. Piece 1. The magnetic staff card belonging to Grace Miller had registered at the technical control room door at 2:15 in the afternoon on the day of the incident. That was 25 minutes before Damien had stepped into the vault corridor. There was no record of her requesting authorization for that wing. Piece 2. The hallway camera outside the control room had lost its signal in that same window for exactly 3 minutes. No hardware fault had been logged. The interruption matched the signature of a targeted software override. Piece 3. A financial audit of Grace Miller's personal accounts had turned up a wire transfer of $250,000, received 4 days earlier from a corporation called Iron Gate Holdings. The company was registered in Delaware. It held no offices, no employees, no business filings beyond its charter. It was a shell built to move money. Piece 4. Latent prints had been lifted from the corner of the control panel in the vault ventilation room. They belonged to Grace Miller. Then the motive. Grace was the widow of a man named James Miller, killed 2 years earlier at a warehouse accident in Gary, Indiana. The warehouse had belonged to a subsidiary of Volkov Freight. Grace had filed a civil complaint for wrongful death shortly afterward. The complaint had been dismissed on procedural grounds within 7 months. Any widow with a small child and an unpaid stack of medical bills would have had reason to want the master of this house dead. 4 pieces of physical evidence. 1 clean motive. On paper, The case was closed before it had been opened. The counsel did not hesitate. Their voices came one after the other around the table, low and pragmatic. Arrest her tonight. Anything less and the story would begin to move through the other families by morning. In a world where the smallest hesitation was read as weakness, sheltering a suspected accomplice was the kind of gesture that ended empires. If Damien shielded her, the capos themselves would begin to whisper that he had softened since the little girl had walked into the vault. Damien read the file line by line. He turned each page with the same slow, deliberate care. His face did not change. But the knuckles of the hand resting against the edge of the table had gone the color of bone. Something was wrong. 20 years in the world had taught him one thing about murder investigations. Real ones were always messy. They left frayed edges, missing minutes, contradictions in small places. This one was clean the way a display case at a jeweler was clean. Every stone in exactly the right velvet groove. He knew that kind of neatness. He had seen it built, more than once, by his own men, but he had nothing to offer against it. Only a feeling, and the words of a small girl who had counted to 3 in a whisper. He stood after 3 hours at the table. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and even. Arrest Grace Miller, but do not do it in front of the child. Am I understood? Bruno, the head of household security, inclined his head once. Truth is sometimes wrapped too neatly to be the truth. Real truth always has thorns. Victor Kane misunderstood the order, or he understood it and chose to hear another version of it. Either way, the timing was not an accident. At 4 in the afternoon, Grace and Lily were folding a small stack of linen napkins in the staff room off the eastern corridor. Grace had spread a folded cloth across the low table so Lily could sit up on her knees and reach. The stuffed rabbit lay on the arm of the deep leather chair beside them. Lily was humming, very softly, the same lullaby Grace had hummed in the library the day everything had changed. The door opened without a knock. 2 men in dark coats stepped in. Behind them, in the pale light of the corridor, Victor stood with his hands folded in front of him. The metal of the handcuffs he was holding caught the lamplight and glinted once. Grace understood in a single breath. She rose to her feet slowly, careful not to move too fast, careful not to alarm the small body beside her. She lifted Lily's small hand off the napkin and set it gently down on the folded cloth. Then she knelt in front of her daughter and took her face between both palms. "Sweetheart, Mommy has to go for a little while. You be good here. Mommy is coming back." Lily looked at the handcuffs. She looked at Victor's face. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough. "Where are you going?" "Just to talk." "You be good, baby. You keep your pink rabbit backpack close. Do you hear me?" The cuffs closed around Grace's wrists. That small metallic click. Lily would remember that sound for the rest of her life. She threw herself forward and wrapped both arms around her mother's knees. "My mommy didn't do anything. Don't take my mommy. Please, please don't take my mommy." Grace could not bend down. Her hands were already locked at her wrists. Tears fell into her daughter's hair without a sound. Victor gestured with 2 fingers to the younger of the guards. The man reached down and lifted Lily, who kicked and twisted and screamed in a voice that was much too large for her small body. The stuffed rabbit slid off the arm of the chair and dropped to the marble floor. Grace was led out into the long corridor. At the very last turn before the archway, she looked back over her shoulder for one final glimpse of her daughter. 30 meters down that same corridor, in the shadow of one of the tall stone columns, Damien Volkov stood watching all of it. He had given a single instruction that morning, one line, one condition. Someone had ignored it. Someone had chosen the exact wrong hour on purpose. He would find out which. Grace passed him with a guard at each shoulder. She stopped. She lifted her eyes to his. She did not beg. She did not plead. She only spoke one sentence in a voice broken but very steady. "Mr. Volkov, I did not do it. I swear it on the life of my daughter." Damien did not answer. He could not. The 4 pieces of evidence still lay across his mind like stones, but her oath cut deeper than the 4 combined. He stepped forward, bent down, picked up the stuffed rabbit from the marble, and held it out to Lily. She snatched it. She pressed her face into the shoulder of the young housekeeper who was holding her, and she did not look at him. Some wounds do not need a weapon. They only need the click of a handcuff and the last look of a mother. 2 days passed inside a house that could not remember how to make sound. Grace was held in the organization's private detention wing, a converted lower floor beneath an unremarkable office building on the western edge of the loop. She was given a clean bed, a hot meal 3 times a day, water without limit, and a small skylight that opened onto an interior air well. She was treated, by the standards of that world, with respect, but she was still a prisoner, and every hour she sat on the edge of the narrow cot in a plain gray shirt, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door as though her daughter might walk through it. Lily stayed in the estate. She refused 3 meals in a row. She sat on the wide window seat of the Eastern guest suite, with the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest, and watched the first snow of the season fall in soft gray sheets across Lake Michigan. Damien came to see her on the afternoon of the third day. He carried a small tin of animal-shaped cookies and 2 new EpiPens, and he set both on the low table between them. Lily did not touch either. "I am trying to find the truth," he said quietly. "I need your help." She looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then she nodded. "Did you see anything strange the day before I was hurt?" "Anything at all that you remember?" Lily thought. Her small fingers tightened around the rabbit. "That day, me and Mommy were carrying a basket of towels down the big hallway. Uncle Victor smiled at Mommy. He put his hand on her shoulder. I saw his other hand take the card out of her pocket." Damien did not speak. His fingers closed around the arm of the chair. "And then I saw Uncle Victor give Uncle Edward something small and shiny, like the little silver stick that Daddy used to put in his computer. Uncle Victor said, 'Keep this for me.'" "Are you sure it was Uncle Victor?" Lily nodded. "He had the lion ring, the one on his pointing finger. I remember because I like lions." Damien knew that ring. Victor had worn it on his index finger for 10 years. It had belonged to his father before him. It never came off. He rose from the chair and turned to face the window, so that Lily would not see what was moving across his face. He looked out at the snow on the lake without seeing any of it. His hand tightened at his side until his nails cut small crescents into his own palm. A grown man could build an empire out of lies. A child needed only to remember, exactly, one small detail. That same evening, after the lamps along the eastern corridor had been dimmed for the night, Damien summoned 2 men to the study who had never once given him reason to doubt them. Marcus, the senior guard who had ordered the vault door cut open, and Sergei, the younger of the 2, who had walked out of a burning restaurant in Miami with a bullet in his shoulder and Damien's arm across his own back. They were the only 2 men in the house whose loyalty had been proven in the kind of dark that did not end. Damien spoke in a low voice, and the door remained closed behind them. "Nothing to Victor, nothing to the council. Bring me the drive that Edward is keeping in the butler's safe." At midnight, Marcus knocked on the door of Edward Hastings' small private room in the West Wing. Edward had not gone to bed. He was sitting in an old armchair beside the window with a book of poetry open in his lap that he had not been reading. When Marcus asked him, plainly and without any expression, for the small silver drive that Victor had entrusted to him, the old man rose without hesitation and opened the safe. He handed the drive over the way one would hand over any small object that had been kept in trust. He did not yet know what it was. The technical team worked in the private server room for 2 hours. Just before 3 in the morning, they carried the drive up to the study with a written summary in a plain folder. Inside the drive was a carefully hidden fragment of malicious code. The signature matched, character for character, the segment that had blacked out the control room corridor camera during those 3 minutes on the afternoon of the vault incident. Edward was brought to the study a little after 3. He walked in slowly, still buttoning the vest he had pulled on over his nightshirt. When Damien told him what the drive had actually contained, the color left his face in a single wave, and his knees very nearly went out from under him. He caught the edge of the writing desk with one thin old hand to keep himself upright. 30 years he had served in this house, 30 years, and he had been used as though he were nothing more than an empty box left in a corridor. "Mr. Volkov, I swear to you, I did not know. If you cannot believe me, I will resign at this hour. I will accept any punishment you decide." Damien rose from the leather chair. He crossed the room and placed one hand on the old man's shoulder, the way a son might steady a father who was on the edge of falling. "Edward, you have helped me find the real traitor. You will stay, but no one is to know of this. In the morning, you will act exactly as though the drive is still in your safe." The old man could not answer. He only nodded, again and again, and pressed the back of his sleeve against his eyes. By dawn, Marcus had gone further. The wire transfer into Grace's account was traced backward through Irongate Holdings to a small attorney's office in Wilmington, Delaware. The lawyer of record had filed 3 separate incorporation documents in the last 4 years, all of them for entities that ultimately served the interests of one man in the Midwest. His name was Ivan Petrov. The web was beginning to show its shape. Truth is like an underground current. It does not shout, but it always finds its way out. For the next 48 hours, Marcus and Sergei moved through Victor Kane's life like shadows he never learned to see. They logged 3 telephone calls, all of them entirely ordinary. A conversation with the estate's legal counsel about a routine dockside permit renewal. A short exchange with the head chef about a delayed order of Wagyu from a supplier in Rogers Park. A brief and quiet call to his older sister in Detroit, who had not been well since the summer. Nothing else. Nothing at all. On the second night, just before 11, Victor left the estate through the service gate with the small black coupe he kept for private errands. He told the gate guard he was driving north to visit an old friend from the academy days who had recently been diagnosed with a heart condition. The guard, seeing the ring of a lion's head on his index finger and the calm on his face, waved him through. Sergei followed a quarter-mile back with his headlights off. Victor did not drive north. He turned south instead, cut through the loop, dropped down onto the lower deck of Wacker Drive, and finally emerged near a stretch of forgotten warehouses along the industrial edge of Bridgeport. He pulled in behind a brick building whose windows had been boarded over years earlier. Marcus was already in position. He had climbed to the second floor of the vacant building across the street half an hour before and had set up a directional microphone and a long lens camera on a folded tripod along the sill. 4 men waited inside the warehouse. 3 of them stood along the walls. The 4th sat on a wooden chair near a battered work table, calmly smoking a thin, dark cigarette. Ivan Petrov, 55 years old, silver hair combed straight back, the long scar running from his cheekbone down to his jaw, as familiar to Marcus from the file photographs as it now was to his lens. The recording came through clean. "That little girl," Ivan said, without any expression. "Is she still breathing?" Victor's voice was slightly higher. "She is just a child. She does not remember anything." Ivan exhaled a slow line of smoke. "Children remember details better than grown men. End that matter. 3 days from now, Damien signs the transfer papers. No witness is to be left alive." Marcus signaled once. He and Sergei withdrew before the meeting ended, moving down the fire escape and back to their vehicles in a silence they had learned in 12 years of service. At 3 a.m, Damien sat alone in the study and listened to the recording 3 times. The reading lamp on the desk cast a low yellow circle over the polished wood. The glass of whiskey beside the folder had not been touched. His fingers on the arm of the leather chair had gone the color of bone. It was not only that Victor had betrayed him, it was that Victor had given a quiet order to kill a 4-year-old girl in order to keep his own name safe. Damien called Marcus in. "In the morning, bring Grace back. At 3 p.m, we take Victor. 3 teams, 3 locations at the same minute. His apartment in Gold Coast, his office at the port, the hunting lodge in Wisconsin." What Damien did not know was that one of the 2 guards on rotation at Grace's detention wing had been drawing quiet payments from Victor Kane for the last 6 months. Traitors never come alone. They travel in a pack, because evil needs company to be less afraid of itself. By 8 p.m, 3 of Damien's teams were already checking their weapons in the estate courtyard, ready to move on Victor's 3 known locations at the same minute. At that exact hour, Victor moved first. 4 men in the correct Volkov security uniforms walked in through the front entrance of the West Loop detention wing. The uniforms had been tailored 6 weeks earlier, down to the badge weight and the stitching along the cuffs. The guard on duty called upstairs to confirm the transfer order. A calm voice on the other end of the line answered in the correct code phrases. The voice belonged to Victor's number. It had been on the internal verification list for 2 months, and no one had thought to remove it. Within 5 minutes, Grace Miller was walking out through the rear service door with a hand at each elbow. A folded white cloth soaked in something sweet was pressed briefly against her face, and by the time the black van pulled away from the curb, she had already sagged forward against the man beside her. At the same moment, back at the estate, a young guard on rotation in the eastern corridor stepped into the corner suite of the guest wing. He said, in a courteous voice, that Mr. Volkov wished to see the child in the study. The young housekeeper who was reading to Lily hesitated for the briefest breath. She had been told the child was not to be moved, but the man wore the correct badge and used the master's name. In this house, badges were never questioned. Lily was walked down the corridor with her stuffed rabbit under one arm. She was not brought up to the study. She was led down through the lower corridor to the side door of the west courtyard, where a second black van waited with its engine running. "Mister, isn't the study on the second floor?" She looked up at the guard with a small frown. He did not answer. Inside the van, Grace surfaced slowly out of the sweet-smelling dark. Her wrists were bound behind her with a plastic tie. Lily sat pressed against her side, not bound at all. A 4-year-old was not considered a threat. Grace leaned down until her lips were almost touching her daughter's ear and whispered so softly it barely counted as a breath. "Baby, you remember the Hansel and Gretel game we played? Drop everything you have, but do not make a single sound." Lily nodded once against her shoulder. She wore 3 small pink hair bows, a beaded bracelet her father had given her the summer before he died, the pink rabbit backpack, and the stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. At the first red light, the first bow slipped through the narrow gap at the top of the window. At the second light, the second bow. At the third, the beaded bracelet. At the fourth, the last bow. The van turned onto a dark road along the river. There were no more traffic lights. There was still one thing left. The stuffed rabbit, her closest friend, the one who had slept beside her every night for 4 years. Lily kissed the small soft head and pushed it through the gap. It fell onto the wet asphalt at the corner of Ashland Avenue. Grace watched her daughter without making a sound. Tears ran down her face in the dark. At 9:20, Damien received the call. Grace had been signed out by a team no one could identify. Lily was missing. The stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the carpet of the empty guest suite. A 4-year-old girl knows what she loves most in the world, and she knows, too, when it is time to let it go. Damien called his contact inside the Chicago Police Department, a captain he had kept quietly on his rolls for 11 years. He wanted every traffic camera along every downtown corridor for the last 90 minutes. 45 minutes later, the report began to arrive on his tablet in pieces. A small pink bow at the corner of Michigan Avenue in Van Buren, a second bow along State Street in South Loop, a beaded child's bracelet just short of the Roosevelt Road Bridge, a last bow near the intersection of Cermak, and a small worn stuffed rabbit lying on the wet asphalt at the corner of Ashland Avenue. Damien spread the city map flat across the desk and set his finger on each point. The pieces drew a straight line out of the loop, cutting southwest along the industrial edge of the city toward the water. He knew exactly what lay at the end of that line. The abandoned Riverside shipyard, closed since 2012, sitting quiet against the river in a stretch of forgotten warehouses. At 11:40 at night, the fog rolled off the Chicago River in slow gray sheets. 22 men waited in 3 groups at the edge of the shipyard perimeter. Marcus took 8 and moved wide to the east, cutting off the path between the main shed and the river. Sergei took 6 up onto the roof of the adjacent warehouse with 2 rifles. Damien and Bruno went straight at the front doors with the remaining 8. Inside, the old steel shed was thick with dust. Emergency lights burned a low yellow along the walls. Grace was tied to a steel column in the far corner, her hair fallen across her face. Lily was held near the opposite wall by a heavy man whose gloved hand covered her mouth completely. Victor Kane checked his watch. Ivan Petrov sat on a wooden chair near a battered work table with a thin, dark cigarette between his fingers, waiting for the transfer papers. At 11:47, Damien drove his shoulder into the front door. The first burst of gunfire came before the door had finished swinging. 2 of Victor's men went down in the opening seconds. Sergei took a third from the roof with a single clean shot. The sound of the guns rolled off the steel walls in echoes that did not want to end. Victor shouted over the noise. "Stop! Stop right now, or I put one in the child!" He swung his pistol toward Lily. The gloved man behind her lifted his own barrel and set it against the side of her small temple. Damien stopped. All 22 men behind him stopped. The air in the old shed turned to glass. "Victor, look at me. This is between you and me. Let them go. Take me." Victor laughed once, dry, without any humor at all. "I do not believe you. You will kill me the second they walk out. I swear on my mother's grave, I do not kill my own blood." Victor paused for the length of one breath, then his face closed. "No, it is too late for that." At that exact moment, Grace slammed her heel backward into the steel column behind her. A toolbox that had been resting on the crate beside her crashed to the concrete. The gloved man's head turned for one instant. Lily bit down through the leather of the glove across her mouth and tore free. She ran. Her small feet drove her straight toward her mother. Sergei fired once from the roof. The kidnapper dropped. Victor swung his pistol back and fired at Damien. Damien broke right. The round tore a long line down the side of his charcoal jacket and passed into the dark beyond. Damien did not shoot to kill. One shot, the right thigh. Victor collapsed onto the concrete with a sound that was not quite a word. Ivan Petrov bolted for the back door. Marcus was already standing in it. There was no gunshot. There was only a single hard punch, and the older man went down onto his knees. 3 of Victor's remaining men dropped their weapons. The shed went quiet. Damien walked over and kicked Victor's pistol far across the floor. He crouched down beside him. "You will live. You will sit in a cell for the rest of your life. And every morning you will remember that you lost to a 4-year-old girl." Grace held Lily on the cold concrete. Both of them shook so hard that neither could stand. Damien knelt beside them. He could not find the words that would fit the shape of it. In the end, he said only, "I am sorry. I am so sorry." Some redemptions arrive too late to mend what was broken, but they arrive in time to change the ending of the story. Grace was cleared formally before the Council of Capos 2 mornings later. The internal investigation team presented the recorded audio from the Bridgeport warehouse, the analysis of the silver drive, and the transaction chain that led from Iron Gate Holdings back to the small law office in Wilmington. Ivan Petrov, Victor Kane, and 4 of their accomplices were quietly delivered to federal authorities through an anonymous channel that the district office had learned, over the years, not to trace. Damien brought Edward Hastings into the study that evening and simply held the old man for a long moment without speaking. There were no words that Edward needed, and none that Damien could have offered. The apology lived in the embrace itself. Damien offered Grace a very large financial settlement. She accepted only enough to buy a small house along the lake, and to guarantee that Lily's medication would be covered for the rest of her life. Not $1 more. But she did not leave the estate. Damien asked her, quietly, if she and Lily would stay, not as staff, but as family. Grace hesitated for weeks. She was a careful woman. She did not want gratitude to be mistaken for something deeper. In the end, she agreed, not because of the money, because she had seen something change in his eyes, and she did not want to watch it go dark again. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Damien drove Lily himself to every appointment with Dr. Amelia Vargas. He sat in the front row at her kindergarten holiday recital, in a plain gray sweater, applauding when she waved to him from the small stage. He ate dinner with the two of them every evening at the same small table in the eastern gallery. At the eastern corner of the grounds, the garden of yellow roses that his mother had planted the year before she died, untouched for 10 silent summers, was carefully replanted. The same variety, the same soft golden color she had loved. Damien understood, at some point in the middle of that year, that he loved Grace, not the fire he had once imagined love should be, something steadier and warmer and quieter, the color of the yellow lamp in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. On an autumn evening, he knelt in the yellow rose garden. For the first time in his life, his hands were shaking. Exactly 1 year to the day after the steel door had sealed behind him, a small wedding was held among the yellow roses. 20 guests, no reporters. Grace wore a simple white dress. Damien wore the same charcoal gray suit he had worn on the day he had first seen Lily through a half-open door. Lily wore a small white dress and carried a red velvet cushion, with 2 rings resting upon it. The officiant asked, gently, who would bring the rings to the groom. Lily walked up. She placed the cushion into Damien's large hand, and then she did something no one had told her to do. She took hold of his hand, looked up, smiled, and said the 2 syllables he had never dared to hope for, Daddy. Damien sank onto one knee in the grass and pulled her into his chest. Tears he had held back for many years fell into her soft, pale hair. On his writing desk, beneath a warm lamp, sits a small glass case. Inside rests a single used EpiPen, blue cap, empty. He keeps it there for the rest of his life, because that small girl did not only give him her last dose of medicine, she gave him the one thing all his power and all his money could never have bought back, a second chance to love. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder. They arrive very quietly, in the smallest hands in the world, and they refuse to let go. Dear friends, if this story touched something inside you tonight, please tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and which part of the story stayed with you the longest. Has a small child ever changed your life in a way you never expected? A younger sibling, a niece, a grandchild, a student, a stranger's little one on a bus who smiled at you on a hard day? We truly want to hear the memories that rise from deep inside your heart, because every comment becomes part of the community we are building here, one story at a time. Please tap the like button if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the emotional stories we release every day. From all of us behind this channel, we wish you good health, a peaceful mind, warm meals with the people you love, and a life filled with quiet joy. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Take care of yourself, take care of the little ones beside you, and we will see you again in the very next video.